Alright guys, so let's talk about the EU, the US and Ukraine. Now, something big has just happened. The US has officially stopped all military aid to Ukraine, and this is a big 180 from the previous stance of the Biden administration. Biden has committed more or less unconditional support, and Trump, he has done the unthinkable and pulled everything out. Now, this is perhaps a confirmation that the US is tired of committing more resources to Ukraine when their own economy is collapsing. Now, fighting a trade war is already very expensive. We can see the damage being done over the last 3 to 4 years with Canada, Mexico, and China all retaliating. In fact, the US has already poured more than $150 billion into Ukraine, and there's now great urgency to disengage before things just get worse.
Yeah, Sean, here's the problem with the Europeans. And a lot of these guys are our friends, they're our allies, but they need to be realistic. And the craziest part about this, Sean, is that sometimes you'll have European heads of state who in public will puff up their chest and say, we're in it with President Zelensky for the next 10 years. And then in private, they'll pick up the phone and say, this can't go on forever. He has to come to the negotiating table. So I honestly don't care what the Europeans say in public. What I care is what they say in private. And what they need to be saying to President Zelensky is this can't go on forever. The economic devastation, it's making everyone worse off. The only pathway, I think, back to peace and prosperity is what the president is trying to accomplish.
The US also can't go around borrowing more money to prop everything up. They simply can't raise any more money. The whole world is sick and tired of either the US fiscal situation or sanctions, so they aren't really buying US bonds like before. Now, if you're Trump and you just saw Zelensky's latest statement, you're also going to be extremely freaked out. Now, Zelensky said that war will go on for a long time. Here's the problem. How long will it take? Will it be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Remember, Trump is only going to last for the next 3 to 4 years. After that, will the US economy dig itself into bigger debt? And I don't think Donald Trump's going to risk doing that as well. Now, another problem is the UK's coalition of the willing. That is something that's freaking the United States out. Understand what this entails, especially if the force comes from NATO countries. Now, will Article 5 be triggered if a conflict happens? What if the British troops and the French troops goes there and somehow the Russians attack them, or they attack the Russians, and then we get into a tit-for-tat confrontation? Will the United States be forced to enter into the fray as well? Now, Article 6 clearly defines what an attack will be. That's a big reason why Ukraine can never be part of NATO. If the troops are being attacked on European soil, part of Europe that is part of NATO, this alliance will be obliged to trigger Article 5, which is a counterattack essentially. It's important to note also that hours after Trump stopped aid to Ukraine, what have we seen? Zelensky turning tail and is now all about heading back to apologize to Trump, heading back to the negotiating table, and to sign that minerals deal. The minerals deal is actually as good as can get for security guarantees. The United States, Donald Trump can't go out there and tell the whole world that they will allow Ukraine to enter NATO or to even put US boots on the ground. That more or less will never happen because it would effectively lock the US in endless escalation with the Russians, especially with the coalition of the willing around. Trump has already expressed his willing to negotiate with Russia.
That Russia says that your administration's foreign policy is, quote, largely in line with their vision.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it takes two to tango, and you're going to have to make a deal with Russia, and you're going to have to make a deal with Ukraine. You're going to have the assent, and you're going to have the consent from the European nations, because I think that's important, and from us. I think everybody has to get into a room, so to speak, and we have to make a deal. And the deal can be made very fast. It should not be that hard a deal to make. It can be made very fast. Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal. And if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long. That person will not be listened to very long.
And now that the US is exiting, the UK and the EU, they have to step up defense spending. Trump is cutting away aid and it's going to make a brutal difference. So far, the United States has given Ukraine over $180 billion. Now the bulk of the funding is going to be gone. 40 billion through US aid was given and 124 billion through the Department of Defense, and all this will be stopping. US aid has been effectively dismantled. And because of this, the UK and the EU, they now have no choice but to step in and plug the hole to fill the big money pit, the endless black hole of cash for Ukraine. Because Russia isn't collapsing, China won't stop supporting Putin's economy as well. In fact, bilateral trade between them is reaching new record highs almost every single month, almost every single quarter. Now, the EU wants to raise around $160 billion to boost their defense spending. But this is just a drop in the ocean, previously been mentioned, and a lot of studies have said the EU needs to raise at least $3 trillion or more. I say it's probably $5 to $10 trillion to even have a chance of building up a proper war economy, to build up their own industrial war machine. Now, the UK has also pledged an incredible 100-year deal for Ukraine, giving over $3 billion a year in military aid for as long as it takes. So we can just do the math. If Starmer is truly sincere about this, $3 billion a year times 100 years, that's $300 billion or 300 billion pounds. That is enormous amount of money. It's key to remember that the EU and the UK, they're spending way less than 4% of GDP or even 3% of GDP on defense. Only the Baltic states and the US are even close to 4%. And now Trump wants 5% defense spending for US NATO commitments. Let me just ask you guys, where's the money going to come from? It will come from debt and deficits. And there's a big catch up needed. The problem here is Europe's fiscal constraints. There has to be a big excuse to unleash the floodgates of money. Now, Trump pulling out of Ukraine's defenses just gave them the perfect excuse to do so. Now, they won't do it to save their industries, they won't do it, to fire up the nuclear power plants, but they will do it for defense because now it's existential. The EU as a whole has a debt to GDP of 80%, with Germany below 60%. So that's good news for them, at least on that front, and there's a lot of fiscal room to play with. The US, conversely, is around 120%. However, here's the big problem. The EU is playing on nightmare difficulty. Their supply chains are broken, and Europe's cost of energy is rising higher and higher. Let's not forget, over the past 12 months, German energy bills have effectively increased by 70-80%. German bonds today are starting to cost more to issue them. Investors, they are not stupid. They are demanding a higher return because they know this EU industrial project of raising more money to build up the defense base, it's more or less extremely wasteful, if not quite a bit of a joke as well. It's 0.5% more on the longer end to borrow money, which is enormous considering Germany used to just borrow money at near zero rates a few years ago. And consider how severe the ramp up is going to be. Germany and the UK, they will spend around $80 billion each. The US today is 10 times of that at around 850 billion. But there's a very big difference here. Unlike the EU, the US is energy self-sufficient and their defense architecture is at least there. But the EU will have to build everything from scratch. What does that mean, right? Well, the next big driver of stimulus in the world will be the Eurozone, and it's going to be continuous and it will drive massive inequality. The EU will have to flood the market with a ton of euros, and even more stimulus will happen. And as Trump pulls away dollar liquidity from the world, the EU will flood theirs. And the situation is really ridiculous. EU stocks have rallied by almost 12% this year, and this is despite a general sense of European malaise and stagnation that's coming from low growth and low productivity. Guys, this is a lesson that the stock market is decoupled from the economy. The economy can be collapsing, but stock prices can be climbing, and it's all because of the flow of money. Whatever the EU spends will be incredibly wasteful versus China or even the United States. Europe will be spending $2 for a dollar's worth of output, and it's going to be even worse than the 2008 and the 2020 bailout money because defense is existential. So what's going to happen? The money is going to flow to the top, especially in defense companies, and it'll flow into the hands of the few. And what does this do to asset prices? It sends them up. And that's why we have EU defense stocks flying to the moon. The sector is now 60% more expensive than the broader market. Rheinmetall in Germany, for example, doubled their stock price in less than 3 months. And these are EU equities and not some US tech stock. And when the EU starts to stimulate, it's best to prepare for the Great Meltup all over again. A lot of wasteful spending will happen. Generally, there'll be two outcomes for the EU as a result of this. Now, there's a consensus that Trump's policies are so bad for the Eurozone that they are good news for the economy. But because the EU is stuck in the industrial hell, the two outcomes will be very bifurcated and will likely have both positive and negative outcomes at the same time. Let's talk about the negative first. Inequality will explode in the Eurozone, which will get worse because to raise the money, taxes will have to be raised further there. Meanwhile, the rich will get richer because now a new flood of money will come in and raise asset prices. So I guess you could say that is the positive outcome. And for Ukraine, well, they are caught in the middle. Even if the EU can pledge defense guarantees, it will take years and years to make it happen.
Message to Ukrainians, by the way, to President Zelensky is when you've lost Lindsey Graham, that means you need to come to the negotiating table and recognize Donald Trump is the only game in town. He's the only person who I think has a meaningful plan to save that country.